Hello, my name is Mayann Francis. I am the author of Mayann Francis, An Honourable Life. I am shortlisted in the Atlantic Book Awards for the Evelyn Richardson Award for Nonfiction. I am very honored to be in this position. I also want to congratulate all the other authors who are also shortlisted for the Atlantic Book Awards. This has been a very, very difficult and trying time for all Canadians and for the entire world because of the COVID-19. Then on May the 25th, we had the murder of George Floyd, a black man murdered by a police officer. That has affected black people, and seeing the protests around the world has been a very moving experience to watch. But at the same time, it's also very sad. My story tells the story of my life, my journey, my successful journey, but it also tells the story of the racism and the systemic discrimination that I experienced along my journey. With George's death, systemic discrimination, injustice, hatred has all come to the surface. What I plan to read for you today is just some excerpts from my book, of course, but they're going to be my background. It will not be long, just give you an idea of my background. So let us start now. Chapter 1, The Beginning. My goodness, I disconnected the Prime Minister's office. They wanted to speak to you, said my executive assistant, Michael Noonan. Laughing, I said, someone is playing tricks on you. No, I'm serious, he said, sounding panicky. I have to call them back. Little did I know that phone call would change forever not only the course of my life, but the history of Nova Scotia. Who would have thought or imagined that I, a black woman, born of immigrant parents and raised in a province with a history of negative race relations and racial segregation, would be receiving a call from the Prime Minister of Canada asking me to accept a position that would prove to be a great blessing, a very rewarding experience, even though there were times it was challenging. In retrospect, the foundation for my successful journey was there very early in my life. I believe God's plan for my path was laid out before I came into this world. I was born in Sydney, Nova Scotia, in a community called Whitney, Pier on Cape Breton Island, 3 years after my sister Isabel and 3 months after Viola Desmond, a black businesswoman, was arrested on November the 8th, 1946, and later convicted for sitting in a whites-only section in a movie theater in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. Who would have guessed that my life and Miss Desmond's would merge in 2010? My parents were immigrants. My father, Archpriest George Anthony Francis, and my mother, Thelma Dolores Francis, came to Sydney in 1940. My father was born in Cuba, Santiago de Cuba, on February the 16th, 1908. My father, along with his sister Maria and brother Eduardo, left Cuba in 1929 for New York City. After a series of jobs, he decided to study for the ministry and became an ordained priest in the African Orthodox Church. The African Orthodox Church was founded in Chicago in 1921 by George Alexander McGuire, who left the Episcopal Church where he was studying because he was experiencing racism as a black deacon. He also established in 1922 the now defunct Indige Theological Seminary to train African Orthodox priests, which is where my father studied in New York. My mother, Thelma Dolores, was born in Antigua on October the 20th, 1907. She left the West Indies for New York City when she was in her late teens. Her life in Antigua was, from all accounts, a sad one. My mother was a beautiful woman. People referred to her as the quintessential lady. Mother loved music. To hear her sing "O Holy Night" was so moving. She had a voice like her idol, Marian Anderson, a famous contralto of the 20th century, who in 1955 was the first African American to perform with the New York Metropolitan Opera. In her later years, my mother suffered dementia. It was difficult to difficult to watch her sink into a world where we could not reach her. When we played tapes of opera singers like Marian Anderson and hymns or gospel music, a smile would come across her face. It was beautiful to witness this brief transformation. She died on December 3rd, 2000, at the age of 93. At my mother's funeral, I described her as a proud woman who walked with her head held high. Whenever she wore her chapeau, white gloves and high heels, heads turned, people smiled, and the men tipped their hats because an African queen was passing by. How my parents met in New York, I do not know. The bits and pieces I managed to extract from my mother do not fill in the blanks. I do know that her life in New York was hard, but she also had fun. She worked in factories, studied at night, cleaned her godmother's place, and sent money back to Antigua. My parents began their married life at 19 Hankard Street, Whitney, Pier, the house where I was born. As a child, I thought the house was big, but it was a very small 2-story house with 3 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs. Isabel and I shared 1 bedroom, and Mom and Dad had theirs. It was common in our community that siblings shared a bedroom, regardless of the size of the room. The other bedroom was considered a guest room. The kitchen was where we ate our family meals. There was no dining room. When I delivered a presentation to students about my life as a child and showed them pictures of the house where I was raised, I overheard a young boy say, "That's a shack." I was born at home. Dr. Calder, a black doctor, brought me into this world. He was from the Caribbean and lived over town. Nurse Dobbin, a white nurse, assisted in the delivery. Dr. Calder is also credited with saving my life. My mother told me that I developed pneumonia during a bout with the measles and almost died. Dr. Calder rushed me to the hospital and started immediate treatment. I dreamt that I was surrounded by plastic. I later found out it wasn't a dream. I was in an oxygen tent. My parents decided to name me Mayann Elizabeth. They wanted to satisfy both sides of the family. May was my mother's sister, and Ann is the English translation of my father's mother's name. Elizabeth, you guessed correctly, is after Princess Elizabeth, future Queen of England. My sister, Isabel's middle name is Victoria, so you can see that my parents' admiration for the royal family was clearly a factor in our names. Is it possible my mother had some premonition that one day her second born would be the vice-regal representative for Her Majesty? Chapter 2, I am a Pier deer. For a moment, I could not speak. I was sitting across from the Prime Minister of our beautiful country, Canada, and he had just asked me to be the 31st Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. I stared in disbelief while Prime Minister Stephen Harper continued to speak. All I could think about were my parents and all those warriors who fought for equality and justice for Black people. There I was, a Black woman from humble beginnings, sitting with the Prime Minister who had selected me to be the vice-regal representative. Not only was I surprised, I was also gripped with fear. I would be the first Black person to achieve this high honor in Nova Scotia. Would the wider community accept me? I knew the expectations and the challenge in taking on such a role were enormous. I had 48 hours to respond. I could not tell anyone. I felt alone. I was well aware that regardless of my answer, my life would be impacted forever. Did I want to throw away the opportunity? After all, my parents taught me to walk proud, and as long as I had my education, I could do anything. Did I want my life to become an open book, as it probably would if I accepted the honor? I had so many questions and no answer. My inner voice said, fear should not stop you. When a door opens, it opens for a reason. I knew that I had to do to arrive at my answer. I spoke to someone I could trust. I grew up in a diverse community of immigrants in Whitney, Pier. We lived in harmony with the non-Black immigrants, people who had come from different parts of the world in search of employment and a better life for themselves and their children. People left their homes in the Ukraine, Poland, and Lebanon and crossed the oceans to come to Cape Breton. There were Acadians, Jewish people, and West Indians who lived with the descendants of earlier waves of Scottish and Irish immigration. Many immigrants found jobs in the Sydney steel plant. Some were also entrepreneurs. We were a strong, hardworking, and closely knit community. My father's church, St. Philip's African Orthodox Church, was the only church of its kind in Canada. St. Philip's was established by Reverend William Ernest Robertson in 1921. Members of the Black community at that time were not welcomed in the white Anglican Church in Sydney. The West Indian community petitioned the African Orthodox Church in New York City for permission to organize a church where they could feel free to worship in peace. My father was the pastor of St. Philip's African Orthodox Church for over 40 years, from 1940 to his death in 1982. He was elevated to canon in 1948 and Vicar General in 1970. But Father Francis, as he was called, did not like big titles. He wanted people to call him Father, not Vicar or Canon. Shortly after my father's death, my sister Isabel's husband, Archbishop Vincent Waterman, began his tenure in Sydney. Archbishop Waterman was elevated to the position of Patriarch of the African Orthodox Church in 2015. Sadly, he passed away at the age of 93 on June 22nd, 2019, here in Halifax. Under my father's leadership, St. Philip's became the focal point for the Black community of Whitney Pier. There were numerous churches in the Pier, and it was common for priests and rabbis and ministers to come together to discuss community matters. My father met with white business owners in our community and beyond, insisting that they hire Black people. Back then, there was no Human Rights Commission, no employment equity, or affirmative action programs. Father Francis saw an injustice and was trying to make things right. He would find secretarial and retail jobs for Black women. When I was 16, my father was able to secure a job for me over town in the 5 and 10 store during Christmas rush. Even though the job was only for a few weekends, I was very excited. What happened to me there is still vivid in my memory. I was assigned to the checkout where I bagged purchase items. A male customer at another checkout said, "Oh, look, Niger." No one said anything, not even me. I did not tell my parents. I buried it deep within me. Being the daughter of a priest was not always easy. My parents were both very much disciplinarians. As the minister's daughters, there were so many restrictions. My mother paid close attention to how my sister and I dressed. Nothing revealing could be worn. In her words, we must always dress and act like ladies. We had to sit up straight and walk with our heads held high. Maybe this was training for my future role. We were told not to bring shame on the family name because we were the priest's daughters. So when I failed grade 7, in those days a teacher could fail you whether it was by a few points or one subject. I was afraid to go home. To my surprise, my parents were very supportive and, like me, were in disbelief. I learned that failure is not always a bad thing. We have to look at it as perhaps a message to do things differently. Maybe it is a wake-up call. We have to have the courage to accept failure, learn from it, and move on to something bigger and better. That's right. Try to turn a negative into something positive. Challenging, you bet. Difficult, oh yes. In the long run, it is up to you to move on, to move up, or stand still. As a Black woman, the barriers of racism and discrimination dictated that I had to break down the stereotype, the low expectations of me. So my behavior, my attitude, my education, my determination, my dress, my speech, my confidence, and my values had to surpass white people's expectations. That was my parents' iron rule. And although at times harsh, I now fully understand their actions and outlook. After my meeting with the Prime Minister, I returned to my hotel. I was, I think, in shock. I was alone, and I was afraid. I cried. How could I take on this responsibility? What about the people of Nova Scotia? Would they accept a Black woman as their lieutenant governor? I was mindful of some of the negative comments Michaëlle Jean received when she was named the first Black Governor General. I did not want my family or me to endure a public beating in the press. To help me make my decision, I relied on my faith. I knew it would steer me in the right direction. Before I went to bed, I confided in Mary, and through her, I also talked to God. Hail Mary, full of grace. Next morning, I knew I would be the 31st Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. I do hope you have the opportunity, or you get the opportunity, or if you want the opportunity, to read my story. Remember, racism is alive and well in our province, and Black lives matter.